Diane and I had a little exchange prior to today's service. She had sent me a couple of videos of books that could have potentially been used during our multi-generational moment in the service. And neither of them totally landed in my mind. And so I got distracted and never got back to her. And she wrote me this morning and said, actually, I've come up with something else, just a story of my own life. And one thing I love about churches is the stories of our own lives inform each other. They help us grow as individuals as we share them, and certainly grow as individuals and communities as we hear them. So today, with my title, Sometimes We Step in It, I thought I would use the story of my own life, and certainly just fragments because, hey, I just had a birthday, so I'm getting older every year here. But use the story of my own life as a backdrop for some of the thoughts that I have. I did do a lot of reading prior about making mistakes in diverse communities and how to ask for forgiveness or work through multicultural communities. And I've decided to move further from my head and from research and more into, as I said, stories and just reflections. So know that that's where we're going together. I started out by thinking how I count myself as one of the lucky ones. I've lived as an out lesbian since 1984. That was the year I graduated from college. And honestly, if you had asked me at my graduation in May, if I would have been coming out in a matter of months, I would have thought you were totally off base. I didn't see it coming myself. Sure, I was a feminist and I hung out with a broad range of students at my small college in Beloit, Wisconsin. But honestly, I didn't have any close friends who were out and on campus. The only people I knew personally were two gay men. One of them was a friend of my parents, Bernard. He lived in the Castro in San Francisco, and they'd known him since their early young adulthood. And then my closest friend, Stuart, who I grew up with from elementary school on, Stuart came out to me when we were both in college. And I remember being just so confused. I may have even asked him why he felt like he needed to tell me. When I think back, I think instead of being supported or excited for his discovery of his true self, I was instead uncomfortable and not really even that open to learning more. Unfortunately, Stuart died last year, and I wish he was still alive today so I could talk more about his memories of that time in our conversation. It's with a heavy heart that I remember that he was the friend who once in New York City, as we were out to lunch, I saw two men kissing a couple booths away, and I know I said something that was not supportive. Man, I discovered, we are really the product of the environment where we grew up. And for me, although my parents didn't say homophobic things, they certainly never said anything supportive. And my schooling, although now I know there are people who were out, I was not aware of that as a high school student. In college, one of the only recollections I have of sort of GLBT stuff was when I was at a Holly Near concert. Some of you may know Holly Near. She's a folk singer who was very popular in the Bay Area and in the lesbian community. And I remember being in this auditorium in Madison, and she was up on stage and she talked about being a lesbian. I felt totally shocked that anybody would do such a thing. And not only did she talk about it, but she sang songs that affirmed her relationships in the community. And she even held lightly how sometimes lesbians were seen in society. I remember there's one song that has a line something like, "A gentleman asked if you two were alone, and we smiled and said, no, we're together." I thought that was just so witty. After college, I ended up in Santa Cruz, California. I guess that is where one might say there was a pretty active GLBT community. It was quite a place to be awakened. I had traveled across country on my own prior to arriving. I had lived in New York before, and it was in San Antonio on that trip where, staying at a friend's house, I found myself having a crush on one of her female housemates. It was something absolutely foreign to me at the moment, but it was clear and it was strong. When I got to Santa Cruz, I got a job with CalPIRG, which is like MPIRG here. It's an environmental group that raises money for advocacy environmental advocacy. Once again in Santa Cruz, I found myself smitten with a young woman. I don't even know how she identified at the time. Most likely she was bisexual since she's married to a man now. All I know was that my heart was stronger than my mind, and I found myself tucking a little love note under her windshield wiper while she was at work. I was too shy to express my feelings to her face. We ended up being a couple, and that was my first lesbian relationship. I think this is a good place to just stop for a moment and speak about the heteronormative world we grew up in, and heterosexism. I really do think, just like with racism, it's practically in the air and in the water. Just like with white supremacy being part of a predominant culture, you kind of frame that culture gets framed by the predominant culture. So whether it's straight folks or whether it's white folks, almost everything that is shown to us and woven into our stories is from that perspective. And, you know, at the same time, obviously, there was the far right and the religious conservatism that was fueling that. But it really also came from all of us, I think, in our passivity and in our willingness to just sort of go along with that story. Those of you who have been at MSUS for a while know I often speak about grace and mercy. I think that there's something about grace and mercy that we need both for ourselves and for those we are in relation with. There's so many people who didn't know folks in the GLBT community, just like me. And I think there's so many of us who find ourselves, those of us who do identify as queer, subject to perpetual microaggressions, those tiny little cuts, those 1,000 little cuts that come when we least expect it. I know they come sometimes for me when I'm out grocery shopping or eating a meal or sitting on an airplane or at a bus or at a party, things that are said just in ear reach or to my face that give me a sense of some hostility or maybe even sometimes just cluelessness, feeling unseen and sometimes feeling challenged. I have a couple parties in my mind where I ended up in arguments. One was back in my hometown in New York when the AIDS epidemic was going strong. And I remember arguing with somebody I had never met before who was saying that it was the gays who brought AIDS to America. I also remember being at a local chili party and arguing with a neighbor about same-sex marriage. I think the truth is that these are not unusual circumstances. And I really appreciated last week we were at four of us were at a class at First Lutheran about having conversations about race. And the trainer made it super clear to us that when in an argument, if you in your gut and in your heart know it's wrong, know it's incorrect, know that your beliefs take you to a different place than that person who is trying to spew facts, whether they are true or untrue. Our job is to be an interrupter, to offer a different narrative, to say, no, I disagree. I don't believe what you believe. I don't care for the convoluted facts you are sharing with me. And I know in my heart that there is a system that protects and advances those who are in power. And that honestly, that system does whatever it can, consciously or unconsciously, to protect itself. My arguments were both with straight white men, but they are not the exclusive group who holds thoughts and misconstrued ideas about GLBT folks. So let's go back to Santa Cruz and that little note under the windshield wiper. I was so excited. I was young. I was in California. I was independent, and I wrote a letter to every family member and close friend and told them that I was in love with Beth. Maybe I expressed my love and joy with a little bit too small of reserve. The response was sometimes supportive. Many people were tepid, and a few were in denial. I often think because I was in heterosexual relationships in high school and college that I could see that dramatic difference in societal support. I know that before, when I had been dating guys, Everybody was happy about it. And then all of a sudden, and you who have come out know what I'm talking about, all of a sudden, we who are the same person we were the day before are seen differently, may lack support, may be silenced, and may be distanced. I remember one magical night when Linda and I actually met after Beth and I were together, and we are still together today. Man, it's been a long time. But I remember one magical night when we were in Russian River area of California at a GLBT resort, and we sat in this living room with strangers. And at that time, everybody told their coming out stories. I think it was that night that I really recognized that this experience of coming out and identifying as GLBTQ was an invitation into a community that I had literally no knowledge of. And I think that those coming out stories, although they were different, they certainly showed us many commonalities in our experience. I think it's something that those who've never had to come out take for granted sometimes, you know, that their relationships and their reality and their family structures and their community allow their love and their life to just sort of move forward unchallenged. You know, there's that saying always where some folks ask heterosexuals, when did you realize you were straight? I think the truth is that most folks who are straight don't really realize it because it's just the norm. But that reality of having to come out, and certainly coming out is not a one-time deal. I still have to do it. But that initial time when one comes to terms with who they are and who they love and can no longer hold it in. That is a transitional moment that is shared by many. So as I mentioned, Linda and I got together in the 1980s. I had no idea that she would become the love of my life and that we'd be spouses this long into our lives. Linda's parents came from a Methodist church in Indiana, and that gave them a place in a community to learn more about gay and lesbian people. They found peers who were in same-sex relationships. They connected with the Reconciling Congregation group nationally, and they embraced other people who have faith who were trying to change their denomination and the narratives and practices from within. I wish I could say that was behind them, but unfortunately it is not. In 1991, Linda and I decided to have a wedding. We were fortunate to be in San Francisco, so we made arrangements as a lesbian couple, and most of them were positive. It's certainly not the case for many. Those of you who know my story know that my mom was not willing to attend our wedding. She was unable to articulate why. Clearly, she wasn't able to join us in our love. And although I felt her absence on that day, at that point, I really preferred she would stay away if she couldn't celebrate us. And actually, so many people did on that day. It was definitely one of the happiest days of my life. My father and his wife and Linda's parents and our siblings stood up in front of the crowd, and they declared the joining of our families that were united by our love. I also remember my brother, who's a bit of a political activist, getting up and telling everybody they have to activate and agitate. It's always good to couple the love with some reality and a call to arms. We moved to Minnesota after our wedding in 1991, and we were greeted at our apartment in South Minneapolis by what we called then the MAC 10. It was 4 other lesbian couples who were all connected by Linda, who was a student at Macalester previously, so we rounded out the 10. I had worked in a public school district in San Francisco and at the March of Dimes, and moving to Minnesota left me clueless about what would be next in my career. I remember spending quite a few days and weeks with the book, What Color is Your Parachute? And that book has a number of exercises where you have to weigh different decision-making points. And I discovered that I wanted to work somewhere where I could be out. And actually, even more than being out, I wanted to work somewhere where I could be a mentor and a role model. I knew from working in the public school district with younger kids that that just wasn't the case at that point. So I decided to work in colleges. I got my master's in educational policy and administration at the University of Minnesota. And I remember vividly being in this psychology class where the professor spoke about being gay or lesbian as a primary identity. I remember thinking, that is such BS. I mean, I knew I recognized myself as a woman, as a white person, as a daughter, as a partner, but I certainly did not think that being a lesbian was a core identity. And now I just sort of look back and laugh when I acknowledge that indeed that was driving my decision to work where I was working and to gain the education that I needed. Being a lesbian also drove where I decided to worship. Prior to marriage equality, gay and lesbian couples had to create this whole series of legal agreements to protect our relationships and to grant us access to one another and each other's assets if something terrible happened. Before I was 30, Linda and I had powers of attorney and other documents drawn. We kept our documents in our cars and in our suitcases and easy places to find them at home for fear that if anything happened, we needed those documents to allow us to act in the way that we knew we were connected to one another. Linda, having been involved in the Methodist Church as she grew up, knew the power of a faith community and the support that it could give folks in times of struggle and pain. Me, I'm just a plain old joiner. And so with no family in town, we consciously began to look for a church community that could expand the group of people we knew and the circle of love and care that we needed in our lives. We joined First Universalist when we were living in Minneapolis, and then when we moved to St. Paul, we switched our membership to Unity Church Unitarian. For those of us in the queer community, the gaydar, as we call it, is always on. And just as it is for people in other marginalized communities, we were aware of all the other same-sex couples and people who identified as GLBT in both congregations. And by seeing them as part of the community, we knew that we would be welcomed and accepted. Linda and I had attended a maybe baby class early on in our years in the Twin Cities. It was a class for gay and lesbian prospective parents to learn about different ways we could create families. One of those speakers was a lesbian mom who had adopted 3 daughters in China. And when we joined at First Universalist, Deborah was actually the chair of the board and came to our membership class. We figured that was sort of the divine intervention telling us we had landed where we belonged. When we were at Unity, which actually ended up where we raised our kids, there were uncomfortable and there were beautiful times in those years. I recall 2 situations connected to religious education that were challenging. One was early on when a letter was sent home with our kids that began with "Dear Mom and Dad." Quite honestly, the journey to parenting made me not only sensitive to the realities of same-sex parents, but it also really opened my eyes to the reality of dads who were often just seen as invisible in parenting information and classes. It made me more knowledgeable about adoptive parents and single parents. Quite honestly, when you think about like sperm banks and such and artificial insemination, it certainly was not created for the GLBT community. So I became acutely aware of many families who found it hard to create the families they chose and did so in creative and different ways. Fortunately, the Dear Mom and Dad letter, I decided to pick up the phone. I called the person responsible for sending it home that week, and she was super embarrassed and apologetic. And I think actually relieved to get the feedback. We never saw another note like that again. I hope it helped for other families as well. And there was also a time when I was in a training session for religious education teachers. We had these huge pieces of newsprint up on the walls that were surrounding us, and each sheet had an age group assigned to it. And we were to note our observations of what was happening developmentally at each age. And one person said, when looking at the early teens, "This is when teens start to become attracted to the opposite sex." Everybody nodded and it was noted on the sheet, and I immediately began to be taken over by that physical reaction when you know that something doesn't sit well. My face turned red, my throat felt constricted, my stomach felt tight, but somehow I gathered up the courage and named how it may be time that romantic feelings emerge, but certainly those feelings were not restricted to the opposite sex. And if that's all we were looking for, we would be leaving out a lot of kids. These days, with a growing awareness, thank God, of gender identity, I would hope that such sheets would not contain language that would restrict children in terms of understanding their own gender or sexual identity. I pray that we continue to be congregations that create a safe and celebratory acknowledgement of each child and youth in discovering and naming who they are. Unity, as I said, was also a place of affirmation for Linda and I and our family. Linda was part of an LGBTQA interweave ministry team, which focused on education and advocacy, and she made deep friendships with congregants through that service. When marriage became legal in Iowa, go Iowa, the Unity hired a charter bus, and they named it the Love Bus, and we took 9 lesbian couples to Iowa so we could get married there. Rob and Jan Eller Isaacs, the minister at the time, worked with each couple to construct a short service, and we took our time up in the chancel at the Des Moines Church, and each had our own wedding ritual. And the church also put a big "Welcome Love Bus" in their church's wayside pulpit. That's that sign that you can change the words in that's outside of a church. They hosted a brunch beforehand, and they hosted a strawberry and champagne reception afterwards. This radical hospitality had become part of their ministry during the years when neighboring states did not have marriage equality. I remember arriving back at Unity. The lawn and the sidewalks were full of congregants and friends and families. The mood was over the moon joyful. We went inside, we had a wedding cake and celebration complete with dancing. I think about what that meant to our kids at the time. They looked so earnest and loving in the picture we have at the end of our stairs. They were young boys gazing at their ministers and their moms as they got married. What a gift. It was during those years that I became a gay for pay, as my friend Beth Zemke calls it. I was executive director of Rainbow Families, a statewide organization for LGBTQ families and their children, and then executive director of Project 515, which found 515 laws that discriminated against LGBTQ families. These were laws that struck at hard times, times when there was sickness or death, and they were also laws that struck at times of joy, such as when we were forming relationships or a family. Even as a leader in the LGBT community, I had so much to learn. It was during those years I began to understand our community much more deeply. People who were bi and trans, single parents, folks who relied on government support to sustain their livelihood. All of these narrow stereotypes I had from my white middle-class professional perspective shifted and were enriched by the diversity of understanding our community in a more nuanced ways. It was also at Rainbow Families that I began to know the term homo hesitant, which was coined by a local author, Abigail Gardner, who described herself as queer spawn. She was quite a witty writer. She opened up the window of heteronormativity and homophobia into this greater spectrum. She described how many of us, queer and straight, can be homo hesitant, tripping over our words, awkward in our interactions, struggling with getting it right. I put that in quotes. It shows up when a person has to introduce a spouse, or when they're not sure if being queer is welcome, or when a friend who is heterosexual struggles with what to call someone else's partner. God, I know it's awkward sometimes. I know that sometimes it's awkward for me, even having been out so long. Sometimes I feel weary inside and I don't feel like outing myself when someone assumes I'm straight. At our congregation, we hold 3 values at the core of the community: mindful interdependence, authentic curiosity, and courageous love. I believe all three of these can serve us well as we meander through knowing each other, loving each other, supporting each other, and advocating for a more just society. These call us into a place of radical welcome and inclusion and ask us to live into a way that requires growth and action. To live by those values is not a passive way to live or to build and sustain a community. And we still have a way to go. I know that Jan Vassar, one of our board members, has shared, if you look at our website, it's so hetero-focused with the moms group and the men's group, and not a lot that sort of says, hey, how welcoming we are. So we have a ways to go, and we're on that journey together. We have done a lot of educational work here at Michael Servetus, and I know both at Unity and at First Universalist, at the other churches I've been connected with. Education comes through adult religious education in sermons and ways to reflect about what's happening in our contemporary lives. At Michael Servetus, we held a 6-part series on becoming a trans inclusive congregation. That is welcome to anybody. It's a series you purchase through Trust, which is the trans group that's connected with the UU. So for both the IO group and for Mankato, if you haven't done that, I highly recommend it. We did the 6-part series, and then one of our congregants who's trans volunteered to come and do a Q&A with us. And it was such a gift of her honesty and her willingness to be an educator and vulnerable. And I really feel after that 6-part series and that conversation, there were many of us who were shifted in a way that we will never go back. We've also been a congregation that has been blessed with the ability to hold a ritual celebrating a public gender transition of one of our youth. We've journeyed with children, with young people, and with adults who identify as genderqueer or queer or are claiming their true gender. We are a people of faith who are coming to terms with white supremacy in our congregation, in our denomination, in our churches, in our personal lives. And I have to say, it's impossible for me to dive into my own story about being queer without humbly acknowledging all that I did not know, all I was unaware of, all that I did not challenge, and all that I take for granted. And it's the same thing for me when it comes to racism and white supremacy. It's a heavy time in our world right now. We are tired, worn down by the long-lasting pandemic that has interrupted so much of what we have loved in our lives, when we could gather and wander without fear of the virus or of each other. For some, this call to be more mindful and inclusive, humble, welcoming, and courageous in our loving can feel like just another burden, another place where we're going to step in it and feel guilty and fall short. But I beg of you to find the joy in such work. We are living at a time where the blinders have been ripped off, and face it, there is no turning back. So how does one hold that reality and responsibility with curiosity and joy? How do we move out of our timidity and our fear and embrace the gifts of getting to know the other, who is our neighbor or another congregant or a family member? This service is titled, Sometimes We Step in It. God, I know I've stepped in it more times than I can count. How could I not, unless I chose to abandon the world that I live in? As I said, we live in a time where so much is available to us. There's podcasts, there's TV shows, there's documentaries, there's books, both fiction and nonfiction. The voices that are accessible to us are so rich and varied. And we also live in a location where we can deliberately step out of our comfort zone, whatever that normality may be, and deliberately, consciously shop, eat, visit, attend events, or be in areas of the cities where we are not the majority, whether that has to do with sexual or gender identity, class, or race. Yep, sometimes we step in it. And I hope you receive the grace and mercy for yourself and from others. Although please understand that some of us who live in marginalized communities are often too exposed to those 1,000 little cuts, and your misstep may just strike us on a day when we cannot bear another. You may receive a response of anger or silence, and at a time like that, I hope you can find in your heart the strength and compassion to learn from your mistake, to reflect on the stressors that exist in people's lives, and to continue to stretch yourself and your own understanding of individuals and communities that are outside of your daily reality or existence. Susan Frederick Gray, the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, reminds us that this is no time for a casual faith. I hope that by telling some of my story, you may come to understand the complexities of one person who came out and found her way in the world as a lesbian, a mother, a gay for pay, and a minister. It's only part of my story. Just like when you tell your stories, they come out in pieces that rise up and feel relevant at that moment. Mine is a story of growth and change that has made me so much richer, and it has been sweetened by being a part of faith communities that are constructed on the foundation of UU principles, and that are also constructed on the mission and the vision and the values of congregations like ours. It's an honor to be with you today and to have been part of and have served UU congregations that continue to evolve and take seriously where love is calling them next. May it be so, and amen. I've been stumped with a question, and I still am stumped. So for those who are visiting us for the first time, we open up the mic after someone speaks and allow time for reflection. So I guess I will just open it wide to see whether there are folks in the queer community who have a story they would like to tell, or those of you who are friends and allies and parents and siblings might have other short stories to tell. Katie is the facilitator, so she will look for hands or folks who write something in the comment box. Polly, I see Polly there. But...
I'm Polly, and when I came out to my mom, I was on the phone. I took the easy way out and told her, you know, Mom, I'm a lesbian. And I always said I'd come out to her when I found someone I loved. So it was when I found Kathleen that I finally came out to her, and I said, Mom, I'm a lesbian, and Kathleen and I are a couple. And she said she knew that, and which was a relief to me. And she said, but I have one question for you. And I said, okay. She says, you're not going to go on Oprah, are you? And I jokingly said to her, no, the other two couples, we'll leave that to them. So,
Polly, that is priceless. And I want to say a phone call is not as chicken as letters, which is what I did. So it's all relative, honey. Would anybody else like to share?
Sam.
Hi, just very, very interesting, and thank you for telling us their story, Laura. The slant that has come to me is it happened, I guess, in a group of people that I knew fairly well, friends. It was a class reunion, my high school class reunion. And it really, the conversation didn't really focus on me until because it was beginning to talk about one of our teachers, and of course the thing that was going around as well, he was gay, you know, and I got to know this teacher quite a little bit better than just being a teacher, because he's taught English and literature, and I was interested in it. And we had some very, very good discussions about it. In fact, I went over to his apartment and had an evening with him. Now, I, okay, I heard the talk about that, and I said, I don't care what his, sexual preference is. I find him a really interesting person to know. And what I wanted to say about this slant is that when I expressed that about that teacher in this discussion at this reunion, I felt the hostility towards me because I was a friend of someone who was suspected or people thought was gay. And, probably very mild compared to your experience, but my feelings about this sexual preference and so forth are mine, and I felt I'm not against people. At this time I had other friends that I had met outside of my high school experience who were similar to I said, okay, probably he's gay. I don't care. He's an interesting person to me. But it was the sort of that hostility because I had this attitude. It's a little bit different slant on it.
Thank you, Sam. And I do think that sometimes those of us who are the disruptors can become the focus of people's anger, whether it's around GLBT stuff or around race. So thank you for speaking your truth in that group. It looks like Diane would like to be called on. Katie, did you see that in the message?
I'm not sure. Diane, which Diane?
Diane Dobitz.
Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It was good to be part of this morning. Reverend Laura, I want to just say how much I appreciated your including all the diversity that you included. And I do think that one of the things that we're missing when we discuss diversity, which you included several times, was people who are barely making it or not making it monetarily. I think classism is another real big issue. And I don't know if we always hear about that as you use. I think we hear about racism and homophobia, and I know our congregation at Mankato has done a great deal of work around that because I and my spouse found our congregation, and it was the safest, most supportive place in our lives. But I do think that we sometimes, as you use, maybe need to look a little more at classism in our society, and that sometimes racism is just another way of classism, or anyway, or like if you're disabled,
Yeah,
or if you're whatever. But anyway, I just think we need to talk about that more as a faith community. Thank you.
thank you, Diane. Yeah, Jen threw in and ageism, and Sherry threw in and disability. I think we have maybe time for one more. I can see Jamie, but do other people have their hands up?
At the moment, I'm only seeing.
Okay, Jamie, why don't we have you speak, and then we will close up this part and move into our hymns.
Well, Reverend Laura, I want to thank you for being so vulnerable and for including this wonderful full picture of what your own prejudices were. And I think you're absolutely right. We are products of the civilization we live in. And I think also what we need to do that we don't sometimes do in the media is forgive one another You know, we treat it like a mortal sin, and we're deeply shamed if we make some racist comment and somebody points it out to us. But we ought to be able to live in a world in which that's a gentler interaction. So, I want to say that when our trans member spoke, I can't think of her name right now.
Sorry.
Yeah, that was eye-opening for me. And, you know, I could use the language well. That was one of the last frontiers. You know, I realized how I was unwelcoming to her by being standoffish and thinking, oh, that's really a man who's become a woman, and, you know, not comfortable with that. And, but that may not be the last frontier. Some of our other speakers have said. So we'll look forward to more growth, but that was, and I can't wait to make it up to her.
Oh, yeah, I think we are all growing and learning. And I do think there is something unique about a church community that is bound together by values and by covenant, where we have a greater possibility to continue to learn and stumble and get back up again and, you know, be in the mess of it all and return with love. So thank you, Jamie.
Right. Yeah.
We're going to move now to our hymn, which is from the Teal Hymnal, Answering the Call of Love. Some of you may know it as Standing on the Side of Love. The words have been changed to be more inclusive. So Answering the Call of Love, we will mute all of the mics except for Bruce and Marie, and the words will be on your screen. So feel free to sing at home joyfully.